Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Here it is, Halloween 2022. The United Kingdom is ahead with Canada in second place. Ghana has taken third. Halloween is just around the corner. If you're listening before the big event, then these stories will get you in the mood. If you're listening some other time of the year, keep in mind strange things can happen just about any time, anywhere. The veil might be thin this time of year, but it's never very thick to begin with. Some of these stories I got from the person involved. Others I found while searching the internet. I gave a few names so the stories would flow better. Others, I just went with what I found. When Chuck was 14, I'm using that name because I don't think I've ever used it in one of my books before. Chuck's family fell on hard times. They got kicked out of their house, a little something to do with not paying the bank for a few months. They ended up in emergency housing. They went to a charity that was able to find them someplace to live. They still had to pay rent, but it was really cheap. It was about $100 a month. Money problems are one of the biggest reasons that people separate. Just like what Dave Ramsey says. They run into financial difficulties, and the next thing you know, they're either separated or divorced. Money is not the root of all evil, but it can be the root of a lot of divorces. The love of money is the root of all evil. The mother and the father separated. The kids would spend time living with one or the other, moving back and forth. The mother was still in the charity house. Being nearly free, the place was not in real good shape. To say it was a shack is doing an injustice to other shacks. Beggars can't be choosers, but there they were living in a screwed-up house. Nothing bizarre happened for the first few weeks. It started with a feeling as if somebody was in the room with them, even when they were all alone. During the daylight hours, it wasn't so bad, but when the sun went down, things began to get uncomfortable. Chuck began to hear music playing. The sound was hard to focus on. It sounded like a radio that was between stations, more static than music. I guess today a lot of people won't quite understand that, what with internet radios and all, but used to be you had to turn a knob and you would transfer the radio picking up from one station to another. And if you were between stations, you got a whole lot of static. Whispering began to filter out from empty rooms. One night, Chuck thought he saw a set of glowing red eyes looking out of a closet. They quickly vanished. He wrote it off as being just his imagination. Shadow images would appear in rooms, moving around near the wall. During a lunar eclipse, Chuck went outside to watch. As he stood there staring up at the moon, the shadow of the earth gobbling it up, he suddenly was overcome by a sense of panic. He felt his eyes being drawn to the woods near the house. In between the trees, 3 huge shadow beings were moving about. The sight caused Chuck to run inside and hide in his bed. Laying in a dark room, he could hear footsteps moving back and forth right outside his bedroom window. As soon as the charity lease was up, his mother took the kids and moved to a new location. His folks got back together and the family began to act more like, well, a family. After they'd been away from the creepy old house, Chuck asked his sister if they had ever seen anything odd in the other house. They all had stories of seeing and hearing things they couldn't explain. It wasn't his imagination. There was something in that old house. I'll call this next guy Roger. None of the stories that I read had names attached to them. Some folks just don't want others to know that their lives have been anything other than ordinary. Roger told about how, when he was growing up, him and his brother were best friends with a brother and sister who were about their same age. This led to them spending most of their free time together. Most of the time, this was at the brother and the sister's house. Their family had money, and they lived in a huge house. It had a theater room in the basement. On many occasions, Roger and his brother would spend the night sleeping on couches in the theater. During a visit, the brother and sister were very excited to show Roger and his brother a discovery they had made. In a dark corner was a small door that led into a crawl space. It was big enough for the young kids, but an adult would have had a hard time moving around. Well, that night the kids grabbed cushions from the couches, and they spent most of that night sleeping in this tiny crawl space. Roger got to thinking it was odd that they'd never seen this door before. The 2 brothers had spent enough time in that basement, they should have seen the door at some point. He brought this up to his brother, who also began to wonder about it. They asked the brother and sister, who couldn't explain it either. One day they simply found the door where no door had ever been before. Have you ever read the book The House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski? This weird door kind of reminds me of that story. After spending the one night crowded together, they decided they'd rather sleep in the theater from then on. The sister was having her birthday party, and the brother was going to hide her present in the crawl space. The party went along right up until it was time for the big reveal. The presents had been set behind the couches instead. Roger asked the brother why he didn't put them in the crawl space. Now, the brother asked Roger to show him where the door was. Roger walked over to the corner and looked. The door was gone. The 4 kids began to talk about the mystery door and the room that it hid. They all knew they had spent time in that tiny room, yet there was no door. Had the door been where they all remembered it, the room would have been out under the backyard. They never could explain where the door went, or was that room even real? I know 2 guys named Nick, and they're both from England. So I'm going to call this next guy Nick. A few years ago, Nick was driving home towards Chelmsford, England. It was the middle of the winter, around midnight. His girlfriend was in the passenger seat sound asleep. There was no moon, and there was no moon, and the road was empty and dark. And Nick was enjoying just driving and having the whole road to himself. He cranked it up a bit as he drove. Not like Alex in The Clockwork Orange, but faster than normal. As Nick was coming out of a roundabout, a circular intersection where instead of stopping you drove around until you came to the road you needed, as he was coming out of the roundabout, Nick spotted a woman standing in the middle of the road. She was tall and thin, dressed from head to toe in black, standing with her back towards him. Her long black hair was being whipped by the wind, and she didn't seem to be aware that there was a car bearing down on her. Nick quickly swerved into the oncoming lane and sped past her before he could even get his foot on the brake. Looking back in the rearview mirror, he could see the woman lit by the brake lights, still standing where she had been, but now she was facing the other direction. In other words, she still had her back to him even though he had passed her. He glanced back and forth and noticed where she was standing. The road had steep banks on all sides. How she got to where she was beyond him. This whole thing freaked him out, and he hit the gas and sped away. As the woman was vanishing into the night, Nick's girlfriend woke up wondering why he was driving the way he was. Questions popped into his head. Nick took the next roundabout and headed back to where he'd seen the woman. Once back in the same spot, he looked around. There were no houses or vehicles where the woman might have come from. Nothing in all directions but farmland. From that night on, Nick would awake from nightmares involving that woman. And she never had a face, and she always seemed to be in some kind of peril that he couldn't save her from. This reminds me of one of the stories I received for my book, Paranormal Stories. When Marcelo was 5 or 6 years old, his parents made money by transporting vehicles from Del Rio, Texas to Monterrey, Mexico. Some of these vehicles had to be towed, while others could be driven. On one trip, Marcelo was riding with his father in the first vehicle, while his mother and 2 sisters followed behind in the second. Just about halfway, in the middle of nowhere, they saw a woman in a white dress walking along the side of the road. She was on the opposite side of the road, heading south. As they were drawing close, his father said maybe they should stop and see if she needed help. Why was she walking on the road like that? As the 2 vehicles drew alongside the woman, they didn't slow down. And as they went by, Marcelo tried to see if he could look at her face. Maybe it was the speed of the vehicle or the glass wasn't clean, but he couldn't see her face. His dad didn't really give a reason for not stopping, and they just kept on going to Monterey. They arrived in their destination and dropped off the vehicle. Then it was time to head back home. The whole family got into one vehicle and they headed north. As they were coming to the area where they'd seen the woman in the white dress, they saw her walking along the side of the road once more. This time she was walking north in the southbound lane. Wondering about this apparition, questions were asked. Many folks had seen this woman in the white dress walking along this isolated stretch of road. Nobody ever saw her face, and she was always on the other side of the road, walking the same direction as those who saw her. Nobody ever saw her face. A few ever stopped to offer her a ride. If anyone has, they don't want to talk about what they saw. Growing up, Jack lived in the middle of the woods. No neighbors for about a mile on each side of his family's house, and they had a 60-acre section of land with a swamp on the very edge. You could say they lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer, Jack was about 14. He was out in the woods playing with his dog. As he was standing by some trees throwing a ball, he kept feeling something bump his elbow. It would hit hard enough to make him throw the ball places his dog wasn't heading. You know, when you throw the ball and the dog sees it, he runs for it. But if you throw the ball and he doesn't see where it lands, well, he's not going to run and get it. And that was happening. He would throw the ball, and sometimes it would go straight up in the air because something was whacking him on the elbow. He thought he was bumping his elbow on a tree or something, but that didn't seem right. And finally, he decided he'd had enough, and he was going to head back home, him and his dog. His dog wasn't getting any exercise, and he was getting bored with the whole thing. Walking back to the house, Jack saw some unknown or unseen thing. He couldn't put his finger on it. Let me say it again. He didn't see it, he felt it. Once home, he sat on the couch with his dog and he watched some TV. His folks were away in town and they wouldn't be back for some time. The sound of the garage door opening startled him. It was way too soon for his folks to be home, yet the sound was there telling him there they were. His dog began barking as if something were wrong. Jack went to the front door and opened it for his folks. There was nobody there. The garage door was still shut, and nobody appeared to be anywhere around. Jack walked over and he looked in the garage window. Their car was not in there. Convincing himself that he'd been hearing things, Jack went back to the TV. Once again, the sound of the garage door opening came to him. This time, the dog began to growl and stare at the front door. Jack sat there on the couch wondering what he was hearing. There were footsteps moving across the front porch, up to the front door. The doorknob began to jiggle, as if somebody were about to open it. Well, Jack moved over to the door, and as he was about to open it, he had his hand on the knob. He just glanced through the peephole. The porch was empty. Jack quickly moved back to the couch, and he sat there almost too scared to think. The door handle began to jingle some more. His dog had settled down and found it was time to go outside. The call of nature must be answered. Jack carefully went to the door and looked through the peephole. Nobody and nothing was out there. He opened the door and stepped outside. The dog was right beside him and out to the yard. As Jack stood there waiting for his dog to finish, he thought, I'll just ask, who's out here? Well, nothing happened. He asked the unseen thing what it wanted. The door to the kennel swung open. Jack tried to convince himself it was just the wind. Then he said, if that's you, close the door. The door swung shut. Jack ran back inside with his dog, shut the door, and turned on every light in the house. He sat on the couch, waiting. The footsteps could be heard crossing the porch once more. The door handle would begin to rattle as if somebody were about to come in, and there was nobody there. The sounds eventually all stopped just before his folks drove up. They wanted to know why every light in the house was on. Why was he wasting electricity like that? Well, several months later, Jack's dad went hunting. He came home angry about something. He said every time he would aim at a deer, a something would bump his elbow, throwing his shot off. Hearing his dad had the same weird encounter, Jack told about what had happened to him, and, well, his dad couldn't explain it away. A few years ago, Tom rented an apartment from a friend who had bought the place hoping to fix it up and sell it. And not finding a buyer and having put some money into it, the idea of renting was better than nothing. Once a buyer could be found, Tom would then move on. You got to move this cat before she starts interfering too much. After moving in, Tom realized that there was something wrong with the lady next door. Now, she was about 45, but she looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. The sounds could be heard through the wall, not because the walls were thin, but because she was that loud. It got to the point where Tom was finding it hard to sleep with so much noise. He went over to her place to ask her to please keep the radio and the conversations down. As she opened the door, and Tom got to look in her front door. Her walls had crosses painted on them in different colors. Words like Jesus and angels were scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting in no light whatsoever. The room smelled damp, and there were yellow stains and nasty stuff all over the carpet. She must have had at least one dog due to the smell, and there were cockroaches scurrying about. Tom introduced himself as her new neighbor and asked if she would mind keeping the noises down. The old lady just looked at him and then slammed the door. To make matters worse, she turned the radio up even louder. The next night, Tom had his girlfriend staying over. He awoke in the middle of the night to see a shadow of a person standing next to the bed, looking down at him. At first he thought he was seeing things, or maybe still dreaming, until the shadow began to speak. It was the old neighbor lady. She stood by the bed holding something in her hand. It was too dark to make out what she had, but Tom was immediately on edge. The old lady said, "You should lock your doors at night." And then she turned and walked out of the room. The next morning, Tom saw her outside the apartment building digging a hole in the yard. As she was talking, as if somebody were there with her, but the language was unknown to him. It sounded like just gibberish, really. He could smell something dead out there. Tom came to the conclusion that this woman was well off her rocker. Her elevator wasn't running. Most of the cards were missing from her deck. Tom didn't know what to do about having a crazy, potentially dangerous woman living next to him, so he sought out advice from others in the building. A man living upstairs said the old lady had broken into his apartment some time ago. She'd walked in carrying a cordless drill. The two uneasy tenants decided it was time to call the police. After talking to the officer for some time, it became apparent that only entering somebody's apartment wasn't grounds for an arrest. There were no signs of her breaking in. She must have had a key to everyone's apartment. The police needed something a little more illegal to arrest her. Eventually, the old lady did get arrested while at a corner convenience store. I wonder what she did to upset the people at the store. We used to have an old lady living on the streets of Laredo. Well, we have a bunch, but this one was really memorable. While on the bike patrol, I got to see a lot of the street people who had issues. This old lady had a shopping cart filled with purses. They were all acquired from local stores, but none of the shopkeepers wanted to press charges. They were afraid that once she got out, she would come back and seek vengeance on them. This old lady was well known at the local MHMR, which is the mental health hospital. On several occasions, I watched as she would sit and argue with one of her purses. As she would sit down on a bench and then move away from it quickly. As she would begin yelling at the handbag. Occasionally, she would slap it with her hand or with a stick. There was an old guy who hung around with her, and everybody believed he was her husband. She would slap him sometimes, and every once in a while hit him with the stick, but he never complained. He would just push the shopping cart around that was full of stolen purses. On several occasions, this woman would get into an argument with nothing, just yelling and screaming and waving her arms in the air, but she never quite crossed the line to a point where she needed to be locked up. One day she threatened to stab one of the police officers, and that was the final straw. They arrested her, and back into the hospital she went. She was gone for about 6 months, and then she was back full of medication and screaming at her purses once more. Next time you see somebody who looks crazy, ask yourself, what if there is something they can see that the rest of us are unaware of? Those voices in their heads, what if the voices they hear are coming from another dimension? Just because we don't see or hear these things doesn't mean they're not real. Now try to relax with that in your head. Living in Australia, Gary moved into an old house that had been in the family for years. Members of the family would live in it any time they couldn't afford a better house. The place was showing its age. A 2-story house with more mold than paint. The one and only bathroom was located out in the yard, accessible at night using a flashlight and your shoes. Nobody wanted to put any money into fixing anything since the place pretty much belonged to everyone. Gary was one of those kids who was kind of scared of everything. A noise at night was an axe murderer. The wind whistling through the eaves was a banshee coming to claim him. At night, when he was finally able to fall asleep, he would have the same dream on way too many occasions. The dream always started out in the kitchen with Gary trying to find his family. He would wander about looking in all the rooms, trying to track down either his dad, his mother, or his sister. He would search the downstairs with no luck. A sound would catch his attention that somebody might be upstairs in one of the bedrooms. Gary would make his way over the stairs, and as his foot is raised to set down on the first step, something would pop into the back of his mind, telling him, don't go upstairs. You know how sometimes you know things in a dream for no known reason? Gary would become convinced he should run down the road to his grandparents' home, leave this spooky old house and its craziness to itself. No matter how badly he didn't want to ascend, Gary would begin to climb the stairs. Once at the top, it would be as quiet as a crypt. He would know whatever bad thing was up there was about to appear. He would close his eyes and sometimes put his hands over them, to no avail. He could still see things, even with his eyes closed and his hands in the way. Once he could not see anything, he would know that he wasn't asleep dreaming this over and over again dream. It wasn't until the family finally moved that Gary was relieved of his bizarre constant dream. Whatever was haunting his dreams stayed in the house once the family was away. Some cultures say when you dream you're actually visiting another dimension. All that crazy stuff you see and hear is actually happening in some other plane of existence. It's kind of odd how the crazy dream stopped once they moved out of the house. Was it really a dream? If you have kids or know people with them, you'll know about imaginary friends. Here are a few stories to make you think and worry next time you hear your kid talking to somebody that you can't see. Debbie lived on 13 acres, most of which was forest. She was 8 years old, probably too young to be home alone, but sometimes she was, and that's when strange things would happen. Doors would open on their own even though they were locked. Her dog would run up to the door and stay 10 feet back, barking at something she couldn't see. When this happened, Debbie would hide behind the bar, clutching a knife. Debbie and her younger sister would run around out in the woods playing. The dog would join in. They both had an imaginary friend that they shared. Even the dog was aware of this third person, being something there in the woods. When the family finally moved to a new house, the imaginary friend stayed in the woods. Debbie revisited that house about 8 years later, and she saw a figure moving along the edge of the trees. It looked about the same size as her former imaginary friend. When she told her sister said that she had seen the same image when she drove past the house. Two girls sharing an imaginary friend that nobody else could see but them. I met Blanca, her daughter and granddaughter, at a get-together here in Laredo at the Arts Center one night, just before Halloween a few years ago. Blanca told me her story, and I wrote it up in Paranormal Laredo. I think I may have told this story one time before, but since then I've gained a few hundred new listeners, and so here it is again. One of the most creepy imaginary friend stories I've ever heard. I'll tell it the way Blanca told me, in her own words. When my granddaughter Esmeralda was small, maybe 4 years old, she had an imaginary friend. It all started one night as I was talking to my daughter, Perla, on the phone. My daughter said that Esmeralda was acting strange. I asked what she meant. Perla nearly broke out in tears as she told me, Esme is talking as if there is somebody else in the room. She's having an entire conversation all by herself. I'm scared of what's going on. I told my daughter, don't be scared. Ask her who is she talking with. My daughter only said, I'm scared. I told her put the phone on speaker so I can talk to Esme. I asked, who are you talking to? And she said, Yaya. I asked, who is she? Esme said, my friend, but I'm telling her not to look at my mom, but she keeps looking at her. Esme sounded as if she were mad by this activity. Sunday, I took Esme home with me. I kept asking her questions. I asked her, who was Yaya and where did she meet? Esme said Yaya was her friend. I asked how old was Yaya, and Esme said about 5. I asked, what did Yaya look like, and Esme said, I can't see her face. I asked why not, and Esme said her hair is covering her rostro. We do speak Spanish around home. I thought about Esme using the word rostro, which means face. I thought about it and decided we had never used rostro, and there is no way Esme should know that word, let alone use it. We always used the word cara on many occasions, but never rostro. Rostro is more like visage or countenance. This led to more questions. Esme, what happened to Yaya? Esme said her and her little brother were taking a bath when her dad threw a radio into the water. They both died, and that was why she kept her face covered. It's all burned. I was like, oh my God. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked, where is Yaya right now? I could see Esme was looking at someone or something right in front of her and shaking her head. Esme told me she's here with me in the tub. I said, okay. Get the washcloth and give it to Yaya and tell her she'll have to scrub herself because I can't see her. Esme grabbed the washcloth and then handed it to where Yaya was supposed to be. Grandma said you'll have to wash yourself 'cause she can't see you. I took Esme out of the tub so she could get ready for bed. Esme wanted Yaya to get ready as well. I told my granddaughter, tell Yaya that she can stay here as long as she wants, but she's going to have to be a good girl or she'll have to leave. Esme looked at me and said, she heard what you said. One day I was cooking. I had Esme sitting at the table coloring. As she was talking with herself, or rather with her friend. I finished cooking and served her some food. Esme said, Grandma, Yaya is hungry too. I asked, where is she? And Esme pointed to the chair next to her and said, she's right there. I got a small plate, served a small portion of food. I never saw the spoon move or the food get eaten, but it was still strange serving a ghost. One day my son Juan was playing a video game. Esme came wandering into his room and watched for a bit. She then asked, can we play the game? He looked at her and asked who the we were. Her and who else? To which Esme said, me and Yaya. Juan looked at his niece and asked, where's Yaya? And Esme pointed to the area right next to him. She's standing right there. I was in the kitchen when my son came running in, all scared. I looked at him and asked what was wrong, and Juan said that Esme scared me with Yaya. I asked him, how come she scared him? And Juan said I asked her where was Yaya, and she pointed next to me and said she was standing right there. I laughed and told Juan to not be afraid. Yaya wouldn't do anything. Juan was still shook up. Instead, I'm still scared the heck out of him. When my daughter picked up my granddaughter on the weekends, I would tell Esmeralda to take Yaya with her. One night, my husband and I were leaving to head over to a club. My 3 sons were not home, and I was the last one out the door. I turned off the lights, and I was walking to the front door when I entered a cold spot. All the hair on my arm stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I practically ran out the door, thinking I was no longer alone. My husband looked at me and asked, what in the world is wrong with you? And I told him something was behind me. I could feel it following me as I walked through the house, and it felt mean and angry. Yaya went everywhere with my granddaughter. Everywhere. As she would go to my niece's house, and when they would babysit Esmeralda, Joanna would take care of Esme any time me and my daughter worked or were busy for the day. One day I had Esme when my niece called my daughter and asked her why did she drop Esme off without telling her. My daughter told her she hadn't dropped Esme off. Esme was with her grandmother. My niece had been looking at the camera that showed the front door to her house. She had seen a little girl standing there waiting to be let in and simply thought it was Esmeralda. When my niece opened the door, there was nobody there. She looked all around the yard and even out in the street, but there was no one. Going back inside, she looked at the camera once more. Again, the little girl was standing there by the door. My niece went back to the front door, thinking that perhaps she'd hidden after knocking on the door. Once more, there was nobody at the door. After doing this a few more times, my niece called to ask about Esmeralda, and that's when we told her about Yaya. From then on, she said, "Don't bring her to my house." Esme was attending school across the street. She stayed with me during school days and then went with her mother during summer vacation. When Esme left for school, Yaya would stay in my house. She was apparently upset that her friend wasn't there to play with. She began doing things. In the hallway stood an altar in memory of my sister who had passed away. There were some angel figurines, some pictures, and candles. I was sitting in the living room with my son Marco. We were the only the only living people in the house. As we were watching TV, we heard noises coming from the hallway. We were about to go look for the cause when the angel figurines and all the things on the altar came flying through the room, landing on the couch. My son and I looked at each other, lost as to what was happening. As I began picking the stuff up, I told my sister, Janie, she didn't have to throw things around, but in the back of my mind, I knew it was Yaya. The next incident took place shortly after I got sick and was bedridden for some 3 weeks. My son Marco was home with me in my room watching TV. Suddenly, we heard what sounded like the couch being moved. It sounded as if someone were dragging the furniture in the living room back and forth across the floor. I told my son, "Go see what or who is making all that noise." He looked at me and said, "Nope. If they want to move the furniture around, let them. I'm not going." After listening to the sounds for too long, we decided maybe we should have a look after all. We both got up and went. We checked the living room over. The weird thing is, nothing appeared to have been moved. The couch was in the same position. There was nothing that could have made all the noise that we'd been hearing. We clearly heard it being dragged about by someone or something, but everything was where it belonged. After living in that same house for 8 years, we moved to my parents' home. I had been diagnosed with lupus, fibromyalgia, and RA, all at the same time, and my mother had been diagnosed with cancer. We thought Yaya had left for good since no one had said anything about her for a long time. One day, a friend of my son, Louis, saw her. It was on his second visit that Louis told me what his friend had said. He told me, "Mom, my friend saw Yaya standing in the hallway." I answered, "Oh, he did?" The guy said, "Yes, I was talking to Louis, and from the corner of my eye I saw a little girl standing in the hallway." I asked him, "How did she look?" Just to verify what he was seeing, Louis's friend said she had on a white dress and her hair was hanging down over her face. I was like, "Okay, she's back." 2 or 3 different occasions, friends of my son's asked, "What is your niece doing outside at 3 o'clock in the morning?" Lewis said, "My niece doesn't go outside at that time. You must have seen Yaya, the little girl that lives in the house." They were shocked, and I guess that was what got them to stop coming over to the house at night. My granddaughter Esmeralda is now 18. She hasn't seen Yaya in years. She does have the ability to see spirits and shadows. My other granddaughter, Jasmine, is like us. She also has the ability to see them as well. A couple of months ago, she was sitting in the kitchen, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw Yaya walking across the room, on the other side of the table. When she tried looking directly at her, the little girl disappeared. It sounds as if Yaya wasn't actually an imaginary friend, but the ghost of a kid killed by her father. She must have liked Esmeralda and her family, since she followed them everywhere they went. About a year ago, Ted was at his dad's house taking care of the dogs for the week because his dad had gone camping with some friends. Everyone was out of town except Ted, so there he was, dog sitting. The first night at the house, Ted had spent most of the day playing with the dogs. After checking the doors and the windows to be sure they were secured, he managed to get to bed at about 10. At about 12, Ted awoke to the sound of the dogs freaking out, barking, and whining. He jumped out of bed and went to check on them. As he was coming down the stairs, Ted saw the back door was standing wide open. Looking down at the dogs, they were both staring at the basement door, whining and growling. They were both standing in puddles of pee. They were super scared. Ted thought whoever had broken in were still in the basement, so with the phone in hand, he opened the door. It was quiet down there. He carefully stuck his head through the opening. Nothing. Ted walked down to see if maybe the culprit had managed to get out somehow. The basement was empty. Ted got the dogs cleaned up and locked the back door and went back to bed. About 2 in the morning, the dogs went nuts once more. Coming down the stairs, there was the back door wide open. The dogs were now staring out the window into the backyard. Ted looked out but could see nothing. He pulled the back door shut, locked it, checked to be sure it was locked, pushed and pulled just to be really sure, and then went back to bed. By the end of the week, Ted had both dogs in the bedroom with him. The back door would be open every morning. When his dad got back from the hunting trip, Ted asked to watch the security video from the house. He would have checked the video already, but he couldn't figure out how to get the thing to play. On the video, they watched as the back door would swing open by itself. They would see Ted pull the door shut, followed by it swinging open once more a few hours later. The video camera covered the back door from the inside as well, showed Ted locking the door each time. There was no evidence of the lock being messed with. After Ted moved back to his own place, the back door stopped opening late at night. The house wasn't being haunted, but he was. The surprising thing is it stopped when he went back to his own apartment. Elizabeth and her husband checked into a super old hotel in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At the time, she did not believe in paranormal things like ghosts or spirits. She'd never seen or heard anything. The old room they stayed in had a decorative wooden chair. The seat was slanted back towards the backrest. Elizabeth placed her computer case on it for safekeeping. Then she hung a new dress she had brought with her over the back. They went out sightseeing, and when they got back, the dress was laying on the floor near the chair. Elizabeth figured housekeeping had accidentally knocked the dress off as they were leaving. The Do Not Disturb card was hung on the door, but sometimes these things get missed. She put her dress back over the chair and they went to bed. Before either of them could drift off, the sound of something hitting the floor, hard, filled the darkness. Her husband flipped on the light, and Elizabeth saw her computer case was now laying on the floor 10 feet from the chair. Her husband looked at the computer case, then over at his wife, and said, "I guess this place is haunted." Elizabeth left the lights on all that night, keeping one eye on the room. The next morning her husband asked the front desk if the hotel was known to be haunted. The guy just laughed and said, "Oh, you saw the little girl, huh?" I often wonder, the little girl that keeps popping up here in Laredo, she's been seen at the mall, right next door to my house. She's been seen at the school across the street from the mall. She's been seen in a hotel room several occasions. She hangs out at the Laredo College. She's been seen at the health department down in the lab. It's always the same description. Long brown curly hair, white dress comes down to her knees, and when they do see her feet, she's got shoes with buttons on them. They stopped making those back in 1917. She's been seen out at the arena and various other parts. The last report I got was she was seen up on Alexander Street on the north side of town, and it's always the exact same description. Makes me wonder, are people actually seeing the ghost or the spirit of a little girl, or is this something else, something a little more scary? Remember, the story of The Exorcist started when a young boy was trying to communicate with who he thought was his aunt, when in reality he was talking to some elemental that came through the Ouija board he'd been using. Makes me wonder, what are people actually seeing? Is it a ghost or something nasty trying to get the better of us? Once more down to Australia, where Nathan grew up on a dairy farm with his parents. They worked for a guy who owned a lot of different farms, and they would move from farm to take care of them. When Nathan was in his late teens, they lived in a house that eventually became known as the Spooky House by both him and his parents. The house always had a foreboding feeling to it, like something was always off that you couldn't quite put your finger on. The floors were made out of old wood that had notches cut in them. His mother had put stoppers in them to fill the holes and keep the wind and the bugs out. A lot of time they would wake up in the morning and find that all of the stoppers had been pushed up from underneath the house. Nathan said they had a giant hippie bead thing hanging in the doorway. They were so big and heavy that it would take a big gust of wind to move them. He lost count of how many times he would get up early for work or such and find them swaying back and forth as if somebody had just walked through and they were still swinging back and forth. The odd thing is, he was the only one up at the time. At one point, his mother contacted a psychic to see if they could make whatever the thing was that was haunting the house stop. The psychic drove up into the driveway, sat in her car for a few minutes, announced that she was not going into that house, told the family that the best thing they could do is leave, and then she drove away. And Nathan said not long after that, these things would start stalking around the house. At the time, he had no idea what they were, and to this day he hasn't figured it out. In the morning, they would find the grass was pressed down or trampled all around the house, especially around the windows. His mother had a solar dryer in the backyard, a clothesline. Her clothespin basket, hung on the clothesline, would be ripped to shreds and the clothespins would all be missing. Late at night, they would hear something scratching on the windows. Everybody was too scared to look out the window to see what was making the noise. As time went by, the family would go outside in the morning and they would find that the paint had been scratched off of the walls of the house, all around just about as high as a human could reach, and the grass was being flattened some more. One night, while Nathan was working at another farm, his folks were kept awake all night by something scratching on the walls and making all kinds of noises outside. Nathan had his own run-in with it. He was walking from the barn to the house after checking on the cows. He was walking the path when he heard footsteps following behind him. He would stop, and whatever it was following him would take one or two more steps and then stop as well. He would start walking, and the sound would begin shortly after he began. Thinking things might be getting a bit too scary, Nathan began to walk faster. The footsteps picked up speed as well. This caused him to go to a complete run, and the footsteps were right behind him, only they were getting closer. He hit the back door at a dead sprint and flew inside, slamming the door, and then he looked out the window. There was nothing there. Nathan refused to be in the house by himself. If his folks were going to be away, he would invite his friends over for a party. The idea was to get other people into the house so he wouldn't be alone. People would show up and they would do things that kids would do, but eventually they would all wind up crowded into one room together. Nobody wanted to be alone in any of the other rooms. Eventually, the family landed a new job working at a different farm, well away from whatever it was that was causing all of this trouble. A few weeks after they had left, the farm caught fire and burnt to the ground. Nobody knows what happened, but the farmhouse was no longer there. Back when Laredo was first being founded, just about every little farm and ranch had their own cemetery. There were cemeteries all over the place. As the town grew, the cemeteries became part of the municipality. The folks running things didn't want to have dozens of cemeteries located all over the place, occupying valuable land that could be used for other things like housing or shopping centers. So they began to dig up all of these cemeteries and move them either to the city cemetery or the Catholic cemetery across the street. At the intersection of Moctezuma and San Eduardo was an old cemetery that was started back before Laredo was more than a small cemetery. In 1942, the bodies were removed and relocated. At least some of the bodies. Most folks say that most of the former inhabitants were simply left there, and they just moved the tombstones. This was not the first or the last time that something like this was said to happen. Many folks living in the neighborhood say that all the bodies are still there, under the housing. 1943, under the Works Progress Administration, a boys' club was built on the land where the cemetery used to be. If you examine the stonework, you'll notice it matches the walls that run around the southeast and north sides of the Laredo College, formerly known as Fort McIntosh. The club had more activities for the kids of Laredo. On occasion, they would stay in the building overnight. The boys and then girls who frequented the club said that they would hear somebody bouncing a basketball in the middle of the night. They also said they would hear people in the shower room when there was nobody there. On the west side of the building is an inside swimming pool. One of the lifeguards told me that he spotted a young boy in trouble one day. He was thrashing about trying to keep his head above water. The lifeguard could see the water around the boy, and it wasn't that deep. There was no one close by, so he dove straight in and grabbed the boy. Once the young boy was up on the side of the pool and calmed down, he said that somebody had grabbed his legs and was pulling him under the water. The water wasn't deep, so the lifeguard could have seen anybody messing around in the pool. What could have happened that caused the boy to nearly drown in the shallow end of the pool? Something was pulling him under. Something that nobody could see, but he could feel. I hate it when Halloween falls on a Monday, or any day of the week for that matter. Weekends are best, Friday or Saturday. A full moon is really neat. Just because the best holiday of the year is coming and going doesn't mean there isn't mystery out there that might just scare your socks off. Every day I'm hearing stories from people who are seeing and hearing things that can't be explained. So, just because Halloween will soon be over, don't relax and think nothing mysterious is going to happen. If you enjoyed tonight's show, let your neighbors, let your friends, let your family know what they're missing. Tell them they have to listen, or else they'll miss the show. If you want to buy a t-shirt or some books, you can get a t-shirt with strange things on it at tpublic.com. And if you'd like to get some of my books, you can get them at amazon.com, or if you're in Laredo, the Organic Man Coffee Trike. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murdered 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?